My name is Margaret Ellison. The day my own son forced me to kneel and wash another woman's feet, I felt something inside me shatter not just as a mother, but as a human being. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story, because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It happened in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. The living room of my son's in-laws' house smelled faintly of expensive candles and polished wood, the kind of subtle, curated scent that tells you everything is for show. We were gathered after lunch, the men standing in the corner sipping whiskey, the women chatting about vacation plans I could never afford. I was sitting quietly at the edge of the sofa, hands folded in my lap, watching my son Daniel laugh along with his wife's family. His laughter was light, almost rehearsed the way someone laughs when they're trying to fit in. Then his mother-in-law shifted in her seat and said almost playfully, "Oh, my feet are killing me after wearing these heels all morning." She looked over at Daniel. "You should have your mother give me a little foot bath like in the old days." The room erupted in polite chuckles. I thought it was a joke. I smiled faintly, ready for my son to laugh it off, to wave his hand and say, "Don't be ridiculous." But instead, Daniel turned to me, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. "Mom, why don't you help her out? There's a basin in the kitchen." I froze. My ears rang. The words didn't seem real. "Daniel?" I began, my voice quiet but edged with disbelief. He gave me that look, the one that says, "Don't embarrass me here." His wife's eyes darted between us, and I could see the faintest smirk tug at her lips. And before I could gather the courage to refuse, he added, "She used to do this for my grandma all the time. She's good at it." The room went silent, everyone watching. My palms began to sweat. I felt the weight of every eye on me pressing me down, demanding a performance. I could have said no. I should have said no. But in that moment, my pride and my shame wrestled with each other, and shame won. I stood, every movement stiff, and walked toward the kitchen. The basin was cold in my hands as I filled it with warm water. My reflection in the surface looked older than I remembered, lines etched deeper, eyes duller. I carried it back into the room, each step feeling like a mile. The mother-in-law slid off her heels with a satisfied sigh. She extended her feet toward me, pale and manicured, as if she were royalty granting a subject the honor of service. I knelt. The carpet was plush beneath my knees, but it might as well have been shards of glass. My hands trembled as I guided her feet into the water. "There you go," Daniel said with a practiced smile, glancing at his in-laws. "See, Mom's the best." The conversation around me resumed, but the voices were muffled as if I were underwater. Every second felt stretched, each gesture a reminder that I was no longer his mother in this room. I was an accessory to his pride, a tool for his image. When it was over, I dried her feet with a towel that smelled faintly of lavender. She thanked me with a tone that held no gratitude, only entitlement. I rose slowly, my knees stiff, and placed the basin back in the kitchen. My heart was pounding, my face hot with humiliation. I told myself to swallow it down, to endure for the sake of peace, but deep inside, a quiet vow was forming. That was the moment I knew something between my son and me had broken, and it would never be the same again. People often assume that when a child grows up to disrespect their parent, it's because of a lack of love, some coldness, cruelty, or neglect that hardened their heart over the years. With Daniel, it was the opposite. I poured every ounce of love, sacrifice, and hope into him. I gave him pieces of myself I never got back. And somehow that didn't stop him from seeing me as someone he could outgrow. I raised him alone after his father walked out when Daniel was 7. The day his father left, he didn't even take much with him. Just a duffel bag, a box of papers, and the ring off his finger. No tears, no hesitation. He walked out the front door while Daniel sat on the couch, clutching a toy car, too young to understand that this was the last time he'd see his dad in our home. We stayed in our modest two-bedroom apartment, the one with squeaky floorboards and thin walls that carried the sound of the upstairs neighbor's TV. I worked as a primary school teacher, my days filled with 30 other children while my own waited for me at home. Money was always tight, but I made it work. I cooked from scratch, bought secondhand clothes, and repaired things instead of replacing them. Every morning I packed Daniel's lunch, sometimes just a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of soup, but I always tucked in a small handwritten note. "You can do anything, Daniel. I believe in you." I wanted him to grow up knowing that love and encouragement were constants, even if everything else felt uncertain. But as he got older, I began to notice a subtle shift. His eyes would linger when we walked past large houses with manicured lawns. When we were in the supermarket, he'd glance at other kids with the latest sneakers or brand-name jackets, and his expression would harden just slightly. At first, I told myself it was normal. Everyone notices when others have more. But envy has a way of planting seeds that grow roots deep enough to twist someone's sense of worth. The first time he voiced it, he was in 7th grade. He came home, dropped his backpack, and said, "Mom, why can't we live in a better neighborhood?" "A better neighborhood?" I asked, pretending to misunderstand. "You know," he said, "like the houses where my friends live, with big yards, with garages. Somewhere nice." I told him a home's value wasn't just in its size or the price tag, that what mattered was safety, love, and a place where we could be ourselves. He nodded, but I saw the skepticism in his eyes. It was the first time I realized my love might not be enough to fill the spaces he thought money could. By high school, that gap had widened. He gravitated toward kids from wealthier families, boys who drove their parents' cars to school, and talked casually about ski trips to Aspen or summer holidays in Europe. Daniel learned to dress like them, talk like them, laugh at the same things. He started asking for brand-name clothes I couldn't afford. When I said no, he would sulk, his disappointment heavy enough to fill the room. I wanted to protect him from feeling left out, so I picked up extra tutoring jobs in the evenings, working until my voice was hoarse. I saved every spare dollar to buy him one expensive designer jacket for his birthday. The morning he wore it to school, he looked at himself in the mirror with a mix of pride and relief. "No one even believes you bought this for me," he said, smirking. "They think I got it myself." I laughed at the time, thinking it was teenage bravado. I didn't realize that moment was feeding something dangerous, the belief that image was everything, and that where the gift came from didn't matter as much as how it made him look. Daniel was bright, naturally intelligent, quick on his feet, but his motivation was rarely about learning for the sake of knowledge. He wanted the applause, the validation, the visible proof that he was someone to be admired. When he won a college scholarship, I thought maybe this would be the turning point. That he'd see he could succeed on his own merit without chasing someone else's idea of prestige. But when I visited him at university, he introduced me to his friends quickly, almost dismissively. "This is my mom, she's a teacher," he said, as if eager to move the conversation elsewhere. His friends smiled politely, but I could tell he didn't want me there long enough to be remembered. It stung. But I told myself he was young, still figuring out how to balance his old world with his new one. I clung to that hope longer than I should have. Then he met Claire. She was beautiful, all porcelain skin and silk hair, her laughter like a glass chime in the wind. She came from a wealthy real estate family, the kind that hosted charity galas and had family portraits taken on private yachts. When I met her parents for the first time, I could feel their gaze measuring me from head to toe. They smiled politely, but there was something in their eyes, the same kind of polite pity you give to someone who's trying, but will never quite belong. And Daniel? He came alive in their presence. He laughed more loudly, dressed more sharply, and spoke with the confidence of someone who finally felt they'd arrived. At first I thought love had given him this glow. But slowly I began to see it wasn't love, it was approval. Approval from people who valued the shine more than the substance. One evening after dinner, I passed by the kitchen and overheard Daniel talking to Claire. He chuckled and said, "My mom's simple, but she's sweet." Simple. Such a small word, but it cut deep. I stood in the hallway holding my breath, and for the first time I wondered if my son was ashamed of me. After they married, the distance between us widened. He stopped visiting my apartment instead, inviting me only to his in-laws' polished, cavernous home, a place where my modest clothes felt like a spotlight on everything I wasn't. Conversations at the dinner table were filled with business deals, vacation plans, and designer purchases. I listened quietly, my voice a ripple in their ocean of wealth. But the most painful part wasn't their subtle condescension, it was Daniel's silence when it happened. He didn't defend me when someone made a cutting remark about people who don't understand high society. He didn't look my way when his father-in-law asked if I'd ever traveled somewhere exciting. I began to understand that my place in his life was shifting. I was no longer the foundation he stood on. I was an accessory he could put away when it didn't suit the image he wanted to project. Looking back, I can see the path so clearly. The envy in his school years. The hunger to belong to a world that measured worth in bank accounts and fine tailoring. The small ways he began to choose them over me. And yet, I let it go unchecked, because I wanted to believe he'd come back to himself. I didn't realize how far gone he was until the day in that living room, the day he made me kneel, the day he turned my love into a prop for his pride. But the truth, that moment didn't come out of nowhere. The seeds had been planted years before. I had just been too blinded by love to see them sprouting. After Daniel married Claire, I thought maybe the new chapter in his life would bring him closer to me. Weddings have a way of reminding people where they came from. I thought he'd remember the woman who ironed his shirts before job interviews, the one who stayed up late to quiz him before exams, the mother who clapped loudest at his graduation. But the truth is, his marriage didn't draw him closer. It pulled him further away, as if he were stepping through a door into a grander house, and I was left standing in the doorway watching it close. Claire's family lived in a sprawling home with high ceilings and a sweeping staircase that curled like a ribbon, the kind of place where even the air felt curated. Every time I visited, I felt small, in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child. My modest clothes, my well-worn shoes, my quiet voice, they all seemed to echo in that vast, polished space. The first few visits after the wedding, I tried to fit in. I brought homemade pies, thinking they'd appreciate the gesture. They smiled politely, but I noticed the way the pies remained untouched on the counter, while store-bought pastries from a famous patisserie were passed around on silver trays. Conversations at their table revolved around property acquisitions, luxury vacations, and investments that involved more money than I'd ever see in a lifetime. I listened quietly, smiling when appropriate, but my contributions were rare. Not because I had nothing to say, but because no one seemed to be listening. What hurt more than their subtle dismissiveness was Daniel's complicity in it. When his father-in-law joked about people who've never had the pleasure of a real wine cellar, Daniel laughed. When his mother-in-law asked if I'd ever traveled outside the country, and I said only to Canada, Daniel changed the subject as if embarrassed by my answer. I noticed small things too, the way he'd introduce me to their friends. "This is my mom, Maggie," with no mention of my years as a teacher, no hint of pride in my sacrifices. Just a label, like an accessory he was obliged to point out. The breaking point of my patience came one Sunday afternoon at their house. We'd gathered for lunch, the kind of spread that could feed 20 people, though only 8 were there. Claire's father carved roast lamb while her mother poured wine into delicate crystal glasses. I was sipping water, listening to them discuss their upcoming trip to Monaco, when Claire leaned over and said, "Daniel, you should tell your mom about the gala. It's black tie. She'll need to know what to wear." Her tone was light, but something about it made me bristle. It wasn't an invitation, it was a test. And Daniel, instead of defending me, said, "Yeah, Mom, it's a formal event. You might have to get something new. He let the word hang in the air, implying my current wardrobe wouldn't pass muster. I smiled tightly and said nothing, but inside something cracked. My own son had just suggested I wasn't presentable enough to be seen at his side. After lunch, I offered to help clear the table. Claire's mother handed me a stack of plates without hesitation, as if it were expected. I carried them into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. As I stood at the sink rinsing dishes, I caught a reflection in the glass cabinet, Daniel standing in the doorway talking to his in-laws. He didn't look at me once. That's when I began to realize I wasn't just being excluded. I was being quietly recast in his life. I was no longer the mother whose opinion mattered, whose presence was cherished. I was a background character, someone to be trotted out for family optics, but never given a real role in the scene. The more time I spent around them, the more obvious it became. At gatherings, I was given menial tasks, passing appetizers, pouring water, watching the children while the adults talked business. None of these things were beneath me, but the way they were given to me was deliberate, a reinforcement of where they thought I belonged. Daniel never stepped in to change that. If anything, he seemed to accept it, maybe even prefer it. He was so busy curating his image in their world that he didn't notice or didn't care that I was being diminished in the process. One afternoon, after a particularly cold family lunch, I tried to talk to him about it. We were alone in his driveway, the winter air biting at our faces. "Daniel," I said carefully, "do you realize how they treat me? Like I'm—" I hesitated, the word bitter on my tongue. "Less than them." He sighed, already annoyed. "Mom, you take things too personally. They're just different. That's how things work in their circle." In their circle, I repeated the words, tasting foreign in my mouth. "And what about your circle, Daniel? Am I still in it?" He avoided my gaze, fiddling with his car keys. "It's not like that. I'm just trying to keep the peace. You don't understand the dynamics." No, I thought bitterly I understood them perfectly. I was an embarrassment he was managing. After that, I stopped bringing pies. I stopped trying to join their conversations. I started to keep my visits shorter, my voice quieter. But inside, I was cataloging every slight, every silence, every time my son chose them over me. It was during one of those visits, one I almost didn't attend, that the moment came. The moment when my son, my own flesh and blood, would turn the quiet humiliation I'd endured into something loud and public. The day he would ask me to kneel. Looking back now, I realize something: the act itself wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of years. The seeds had been planted when he was young, watered by envy, nurtured by the validation of people who valued wealth over character. And by the time it happened, I was just the last prop left in his performance. But that day in their living room, with the basin of warm water in my hands, my knees pressing into the carpet, his voice carrying over the polite laughter, was the day the performance ended for me. I didn't know how yet, but I would reclaim my dignity. And when I did, Daniel would learn that the woman he'd been trying to reshape into something acceptable had been holding far more strength than he ever gave her credit for. There's a particular kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It's the quiet kind, the kind that slips in during casual conversations, tucked inside laughter, wrapped in the tone of someone who knows exactly how to cut without leaving a visible wound. That's how I heard my son mock me for the first time. It was a Saturday evening, one of those forced family bonding dinners at Daniel and Claire's place. They had invited a small circle of friends, people from her side, of course. The living room glowed with the warm light of a chandelier that probably cost more than my car. Soft jazz hummed in the background, and the smell of expensive wine filled the air. I had been in the kitchen helping Claire prepare the last of the appetizers. She was arranging them on a marble platter while I quietly washed a cutting board. Their voices carried easily from the adjacent dining room. "Daniel, your mom is so down to earth," one of their friends said. It was an innocent enough comment. But I froze when I heard Daniel chuckle, that low, performative chuckle he used when he wanted to signal something without saying it outright. Yeah, he replied, she's very simple. She's never been one for luxury. I mean, she still uses the same kettle she's had for 20 years. Laughter rippled around the table. Claire's voice joined in light and teasing. Oh, tell them about the casserole dish. Daniel laughed again, leaning into the performance. Right, the one she's been cooking in since I was a kid. I swear it's older than I am. I told her she should replace it, but she says it still works just fine. More laughter. I stood there in the kitchen, my hands motionless under the stream of water. The cutting board slipped slightly in my grip. They were laughing at my life, at the choices I'd made out of necessity, the things I'd cherished because they had history. To them, it was quaint. To Daniel, it was a joke worth sharing. I turned off the tap, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I told myself to breathe, to walk into that dining room with a calm face and a steady voice. But when I did, all the eyes that landed on me were already tinted with the kind of polite amusement people reserve for someone they've already decided is beneath them. I smiled faintly, set down the platter, and took my seat. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. Dinner went on, but I barely tasted a thing. My mind kept replaying his tone, the way he'd leaned into the mockery, how comfortable he'd been turning me into a story for their entertainment. It wasn't the first time I realized. I thought back to little moments, the way he'd translate my words into fancier phrasing when we were around his in-laws, the subtle jokes about my old car, the way he'd skirt around, mentioning my job as a teacher, as if it were an outdated relic rather than something to be proud of. The truth hit me like a cold splash of water. Daniel wasn't just embarrassed by me in certain settings, he was actively creating a version of me that fit his narrative. A harmless, outdated, slightly laughable mother. Someone who could make others feel good about themselves by comparison. That night, when the guests had left and I was gathering my coat, I lingered by the door. Daniel, I said quietly, do you realize how it feels to be laughed at for the way I live? He glanced over his shoulder, frowning. Mom, you're being too sensitive. It's just lighthearted. No one meant anything by it. Maybe they didn't, I said, my voice tight. But you did. He sighed, clearly impatient. Look, you have to understand, not everyone grew up like we did. They're just different. I'm just trying to make things comfortable for everyone. Comfortable for them, I corrected. He didn't answer. He didn't need to, his silence was enough. After that night, I stopped offering pieces of myself in their home. No more stories from my past. No more handmade dishes. I became quieter, watchful. I smiled when spoken to, helped when asked, but I no longer gave them anything that could be turned into a punchline. But inside, something else began to grow, not bitterness exactly, but a quiet, steady resolve. If Daniel wanted to shape me into a caricature, I would let him. I would let him believe I was harmless, forgettable, small. Because the day would come when his pride would cost him something. And when it did, I would be ready. In the weeks that followed, the distance between us became even more pronounced. He called less. When he did, the conversations were clipped full of updates about his work and social calendar, but empty of anything real. I knew better than to ask too many questions. His tone made it clear that my curiosity was no longer welcome. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend, Martha, at the market. She had been my colleague back when I taught, and she still worked in the district's administration. We caught up quickly, and when I mentioned Daniel, her smile faltered slightly. I heard his business is going through some trouble, she said, lowering her voice. Word is he's overextended himself. Too many investments, not enough return. It was the first I'd heard of it. Daniel hadn't breathed a word to me. I thanked her, masking my surprise, and walked home with my mind spinning. If what Martha said was true, it explained some things, the slightly forced laughter when I'd seen him last, the way he'd been even more eager to impress his in-laws lately. Pride, I thought. He'd rather let me think he was doing perfectly than admit he needed help. And that was when I began to see the outline of something, a shift in the balance I'd been waiting for. Daniel thought I was powerless in his world. He didn't know that I still had threads of influence in mine. I still knew people in education and local business in the quiet corners where real opportunities are made without fanfare. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I could feel the moment coming, the moment where he would have no choice but to look at me differently. For now, though, I kept my head down. I let him laugh when he thought I wasn't listening. I let him believe I was the small, simple woman he'd painted for others. Because if there's one thing I learned as a teacher and as a mother, it's that the most important lessons aren't delivered in the middle of the noise. They're given when the room goes quiet and the person is forced to look you in the eye. And when that moment came, I would make sure my son remembered who I really was. Humiliation has a strange way of settling in you. It doesn't always burn hot and loud, sometimes it seeps in quietly like smoke under a door, curling through the corners of your mind until it's everywhere. After that night, the mocking over dinner, the laughter that treated my life as a punchline, I went home and sat in my living room for hours without turning on the lights. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock Daniel used to complain about when he lived here. I replayed every moment in my head. Not just that evening, but the years leading up to it. The small dismissals, the sidelong glances, the calculated silences, and the kneeling. God, the kneeling. That was the sharpest thorn lodged in my memory, replaying in an endless loop. I'd been telling myself for months that if I kept my head down, if I avoided confrontation, I could keep the peace. But peace is a fragile thing when one side keeps pushing you lower. Sooner or later, you hit the floor, literally in my case, and realize you've already given up more than you ever intended. That night, sitting in the dim glow of the streetlight through my curtains, I made a decision. A silent vow. I would never let my son humiliate me again. Not in public, not in private. Not for the sake of fitting in with his wife's family. Not for any reason at all. And if that meant changing the way I interacted with him, then so be it. The next time he called 3 days later, I kept my voice even polite, but not overly warm. I didn't volunteer information about my day, didn't ask about his business or his social life. I answered his questions simply and let the silences stretch until he felt the need to fill them. He noticed. "You sound different," he said at one point. "I'm just tired," I replied. "I've been keeping to myself." It wasn't entirely a lie. I had been keeping to myself, but not out of exhaustion. I was thinking, planning, watching. I didn't stop attending the occasional family gatherings at his in-laws' house, not because I enjoyed them, but because I wanted to stay close enough to observe. I noticed things I'd missed before, how often Daniel brought up business opportunities in casual conversation, how quick he was to assure his father-in-law that everything's under control, how he deflected questions about finances with jokes. It lined up too neatly with what Martha had told me at the market, that his business might be in trouble. I didn't press him about it. I knew better than to corner a man whose pride was already fragile. But I kept my ears open. And in the meantime, I began to reclaim small pieces of my dignity in ways he probably didn't even notice. At dinners, I stopped jumping up to refill drinks or clear plates unless I wanted to. If someone asked me to do something demeaning in that light-hearted way they had, I smiled, shook my head gently, and said, "Oh, I'm fine. Right here. Thank you." When Claire's mother once handed me a stack of laundry, "Since you have such a careful touch," I set it back down on the counter and replied, "That's kind of you, but I'm not here to work. I came to spend time with my family." The look on her face was worth the quiet satisfaction I felt all evening. Daniel didn't comment on these small refusals, but I could tell he noticed. His glances were longer, his tone slightly tighter. He didn't quite know what to do with a version of me that wasn't passively agreeable. Outside of their world, I started investing my time in mine. I reconnected with old friends from the school district. I attended a few local council meetings just to remind myself of the networks I still had. I even began volunteering at the community library again, a place where people treated me with warmth and respect, where my contributions mattered. It was during one of those volunteer shifts that I overheard a conversation that sharpened my quiet vow into something more strategic. Two businessmen were discussing an upcoming education initiative in the city, one that would require significant funding and investment. The details were vague, but I caught enough to realize it was the kind of opportunity Daniel would salivate over if he knew about it. I filed it away in the back of my mind. That evening, I thought about how the world works in layers. There's the glittering surface Daniel was so desperate to stay afloat in, and then there are the quiet undercurrents, the places where real connections are made without the spotlight. I lived in those undercurrents for decades as a teacher navigating school boards, fundraising committees, and local politics. I still knew how to swim there, and if Daniel's business was truly on shaky ground, there would come a time when the surface would fail him and he'd have to dip into those currents whether he liked it or not. When that time came, I wouldn't push him under. But I also wouldn't pull him out for free. I didn't want revenge in the dramatic movie scene way. I didn't want to ruin him or see him grovel in the dirt. What I wanted was for him to look at me, really see me, and realize that the dignity he'd taken from me was something I had never actually lost. Weeks passed. Our interactions were civil but cool. I kept showing up to gatherings not because I enjoyed them, but because staying present meant staying informed. I could see subtle signs that all wasn't well in his business, the slightly forced confidence when talking about upcoming projects, the way he steered conversations away from numbers. And I could feel the shift in myself too. The woman who had once knelt on that carpet basin in hand was still inside me, but she was no longer in charge. In her place was someone quieter, steadier, and infinitely more dangerous to Daniel's comfortable narrative. Every time I looked at him now, I no longer saw just my son. I saw a man whose pride had been built on shaky scaffolding, and I knew that when it started to collapse, he'd be forced to turn to the very foundation he'd once dismissed. And I would be ready. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that people who feel entitled to belittle you rarely stop on their own. Once they sense that you'll take it, they push further, testing the limits. And my son's in-laws had decided there were no limits with me. It started subtly after the kneeling incident, but over the weeks that followed, the disdain became open, casual, and perhaps, worst of all, expected. At their family lunches, I noticed a shift in the way tasks were handed out. The first few times it was phrased politely, "Maggie, would you mind pouring the tea?" Or, "Could you help with the salad?" Small, reasonable requests that didn't bother me. But slowly, the language changed. One Sunday, I walked in, and Claire's mother, still in her heels and jewelry, handed me a stack of folded napkins without even looking up from her phone. "Set the table," she said, as if I were the help. No greeting, no please. I set the table without saying a word, but inside, I was keeping count. A week later, her father waved me toward the kitchen with his fork. "The roast needs checking. You know your way around an oven, right?" The table laughed. Even Daniel smirked, sipping his wine without lifting a finger. That day, I decided I would not allow their comfort to come at the expense of my dignity, not anymore. So I began practicing a quiet resistance. When they tried to hand me menial work in front of guests, I smiled faintly and said, "Thank you, but I'm here to enjoy the meal, not run it." The first time I said it, Claire's mother blinked in surprise, clearly unused to pushback. Daniel looked at me sharply, but I didn't meet his eyes. The thing about people like that is when you refuse to play the role they've assigned you, they don't know what to do. But Daniel. He didn't rush to my defense, not once. One afternoon in early spring, we were gathered for a small barbecue in their backyard. The air smelled of grilled meat and expensive perfume. Claire's younger sister Melissa was perched on a lounger sipping a cocktail. She watched me for a moment, then tilted her head and said loudly, "Daniel, it's so nice that your mom keeps busy. Do you still have her do your laundry when she visits?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell. It was a clear jab, a reminder to everyone that in their eyes, I was a woman whose worth came from domestic chores. Daniel chuckled. Not anymore. Claire handles most of it now. I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I kept my voice steady. You must be mistaken, I said, looking straight at Melissa. I haven't done my son's laundry since he was in college. He's quite capable of handling his own life. Melissa blinked clearly, not expecting me to respond, and turned her attention back to her drink. But Daniel's face tightened. Later, as I was leaving, he pulled me aside. Mom, why did you say that? He asked in a low voice. Because it's the truth, I said simply. You don't have to make it sound like I can't take a joke. Daniel, I said. Meeting his eyes, what you call a joke, I call disrespect. And I won't sit quietly for it anymore. His mouth opened, then closed. He didn't argue, but he didn't apologize either. That night, I realized something important. Daniel had no intention of defending me, because in his mind, defending me would mean lowering himself in front of these people. And his pride, his desperate need to be seen as one of them, was stronger than any loyalty to me. It should have broken me. In some ways it did. But it also clarified something I'd been circling around for months. If I wanted my dignity restored, I couldn't rely on him to give it back to me. I would have to take it. The opportunity to do that came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, while volunteering at the library, I ran into an old acquaintance, Charles Whitman, a retired school board member who had gone on to work in city development. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, but then he mentioned something that caught my attention. There's a proposal going through for a big community education center, he said. They're looking for private investors. If it passes, it'll be the largest project of its kind in the city. I nodded politely, but my mind was already racing. This was the kind of project Daniel would want in on, a flashy, high-profile investment that would boost his standing with the very people he was trying so hard to impress. And here I was, standing in front of someone who could put him at the table, or keep him out of the room entirely. I didn't tell Charles about Daniel. I simply asked a few careful questions and left with the information tucked safely away. That evening, when I got home, I sat at my kitchen table, the steam from my tea curling upward, and thought about all the times Daniel had let me be diminished in front of others, all the times he'd chosen their approval over my respect. I thought about the basin of water, the feel of the plush carpet beneath my knees, the smirk on Claire's face. And I knew without a flicker of doubt that when the time came, I would have the leverage to turn the tables. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Because sometimes the only way to teach a person the value of something is to make them realize they can't have it without paying a price. For now, I kept my composure. I still attended the occasional family lunch. I still endured the sideways comments and the accidental jabs. But inside, I wasn't the same. I wasn't the woman they thought they could mold into a servant. I was the woman who would stand unshaken when their carefully built world started to crack. And that crack was coming. I could feel it. By the time spring settled into summer, the tension between Daniel and me had thickened into something you could almost taste in the air. We hadn't had a real conversation in months, only surface-level exchanges, the kind where each person says just enough to be polite, but nothing deep enough to risk truth. I knew it couldn't go on like that forever. Eventually, something would break. And it did. It happened after another one of those suffocating family lunches at Claire's parents' house. I had been seated at the far end of the table next to Melissa, who spent most of the meal scrolling through her phone. At one point, Claire's father, clearly in a jovial mood after too much wine, leaned down the table and said, "Maggie, you're awfully quiet today. You don't have much to contribute to these business talks, do you?" The table erupted in light laughter. I smiled faintly. Not much to say about things I've never been invited to take part in. I replied, my tone calm but pointed. The laughter faltered. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. After dessert, I excused myself early, claiming I had somewhere to be. Daniel walked me out to my car. His steps clipped his jaw tight. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway. "Mom, what was that at the table?" He asked, his voice low but sharp. "What was what?" I said, unlocking my car door. "You embarrassed them." I turned to face him, leaning against the door. "I embarrassed them, Daniel?" I answered a question that was meant to belittle me in front of everyone. I wasn't rude, I was honest. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing back toward the house. "That's not how it works here. You have to let things slide sometimes. That's how you keep the peace." "No, Daniel," I said quietly. "That's how you keep the peace, by letting them treat me however they want, as long as your place in their good graces stays secure." His eyes flashed. "You don't understand the dynamics here. This isn't your world." I took a step closer. "You're right. It's not my world. But it's yours, and you've decided that in your world, I'm the one who's expendable." He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. "I've watched you, Daniel. I've watched you laugh when they mock me, stay silent when they assign me work like I'm staff, and change the subject when I'm spoken to as if I don't matter. And I need you to hear me clearly. I will not be humiliated for your convenience ever again." For a moment, I thought he might apologize. His jaw slackened and his eyes flickered with something, guilt maybe, but then his pride kicked in. "I'm just trying to make it work," he muttered. "You could try a little harder to fit in." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fit in? I raised you with respect, Daniel. I taught you to value people for their character, not their bank accounts. If I can't fit in with people who think dignity is optional, then maybe I'm better off standing out." He didn't have an answer for that. We stood there in silence, the warm evening air buzzing with the sound of cicadas. Finally, I got into my car, started the engine, and said, "One day, Daniel, you're going to find yourself in a position where you'll need something from me, something only I can give you. And when that day comes, you'll remember this conversation." His brow furrowed as if he didn't quite know whether I was warning him or threatening him. In truth, it was both. I drove away without looking back. Over the next few weeks, I kept my distance. I didn't call him, and when he called me, I kept the conversation short. I could sense his irritation growing, but I didn't give him an opening to pull me back into the role he preferred, the compliant, agreeable mother who never challenged him. Instead, I focused on strengthening the connections he didn't know I had. I attended more community events, reconnected with retired colleagues, and quietly positioned myself within circles that still held influence in the city. It was at one of these gatherings, a modest dinner hosted by the local education board, that I heard the news that made me pause mid-sip of my tea. One of the board members, a man named Greg, who'd always had a soft spot for my work as a teacher, mentioned that the proposed community education center had moved forward to the funding stage. "They're looking for private partners," he said. "But it's going to be competitive. They want people with both resources and credibility in the community." Credibility. A word Daniel could no longer claim without question. I kept my expression neutral, but inside the pieces were moving. If Daniel's business troubles were as real as I suspected, an opportunity like this could be a lifeline for him. And the gatekeepers to that opportunity, well, they were people who still took my calls. When I got home that night, I sat in my living room, the lamp casting a soft glow on the walls, and thought about the conversation in the driveway. How certain Daniel had been that I didn't belong in his world. He was right. I didn't belong there. But he still belonged in mine, whether he liked it or not. And in my world, respect wasn't a luxury. It was the price of admission. Sometimes the truth doesn't come to you in a dramatic confession. It trickles in a word here, a detail there, until suddenly you realize you've been standing in a rising tide without even knowing it. For months, I'd suspected that Daniel's business wasn't doing as well as he let on. There were small tells: the way he spoke about delayed projects, the slightly longer pauses when people asked him about revenue, the avoidance of specifics. But suspicion is one thing. Proof is another. The proof came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at the library stacking books on the return cart when I spotted my friend Martha walking in. She'd been the one months earlier to mention that Daniel might be overextended, and from the look on her face, I knew she had more to say. Over coffee at the small cafe next door, she leaned in and lowered her voice. Maggie, I think your son's in serious trouble. My hands tightened around the cup. What kind of trouble? Financial? He pitched a big project to a few potential backers, but from what I hear, they pulled out. And he's got loans, significant ones. If he doesn't find another investor soon, he could lose more than just the project. He could lose the business. I listened quietly, my mind already shifting into a kind of slow, deliberate calculation. I didn't ask how she knew Martha had her ways, and I trusted her sources. Then she added, "You know the new community education center proposal. The one I mentioned before? They're only considering investors who have both the money and a strong reputation in the local community. Your son's name came up in early talks, but..." She hesitated. But I prompted. "But the board's not convinced he's the right fit. They think he's too new, too flashy. They'd want someone to vouch for him. Someone with long-standing credibility." I stirred my coffee slowly, my mind already connecting the dots. I didn't have the money to fund a project like that myself, but I did have something just as valuable: a network built over decades of work in education. A network Daniel had ignored, dismissed, even mocked. Until now. I didn't say anything to Martha. I just smiled, thanked her for the update, and walked home through the crisp afternoon air. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the steam curling up from my mug of tea. I thought about the last few years, about Daniel's smirks, his silences, the way he'd turned me into a prop in his social life. And I thought about the day he made me kneel. How he'd looked down at me, voice light but eyes sharp, as if I were an object to be placed wherever he needed me for the sake of appearances. Now the positions were reversed. He needed something only I could give, not money, but legitimacy. My name, my reputation. The quiet respect I'd built over a lifetime of doing work that mattered. I could hear his voice already, the way he'd have to shape the words. "This is my mother. She's the reason I'm here." It wouldn't be forced humility, it would be survival. The thought didn't fill me with glee. This wasn't about humiliating him. It was about balance. Restoring what he'd taken from me in front of others, not through vengeance, but through the kind of lesson you can't ignore. 2 weeks later, the opportunity presented itself. It was a Friday evening, and I was home reading when the phone rang. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. "Mom," he said, his voice unusually measured. "Do you have a minute to talk?" "I do," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I wanted to ask your opinion on something." That was new. Daniel didn't usually ask for my opinion unless it was about a gift for Claire or a recipe from his childhood. He explained in broad strokes that he was pursuing a major opportunity with the new community education center. "It's high profile," he said, "and it could really boost the business. But they're being particular about who gets involved." Particular? How? I asked, though I already knew. "They want people with credibility in the community," he said. "And, well, you've got a lot of history with the education board. You know the right people. I thought maybe you could put in a word for me." There it was, the shift I'd been waiting for. I let a pause hang in the air long enough for him to feel it. "Daniel," I said finally, "you know there was a time when you were happy to pretend my work and my connections didn't matter. You were embarrassed by where you came from." "That's not true," he said quickly, but there was no conviction in his voice. "It is true," I replied calmly. "And now you want me to use the very things you dismissed to open a door for you." Silence. Then more quietly, I'm asking, "Because I need your help." Those were words I had never heard from him as an adult. They landed heavy in the air between us. "I'm not opposed to helping," I said, "but I won't do it quietly, Daniel. If I vouch for you, it will be in public." You will acknowledge me not as a favor, not as an afterthought, but as someone whose name and work you respect. Can you do that? He hesitated. I imagined him weighing his pride against the reality of his situation. Finally, he said, yes. It wasn't enthusiastic. It was survival. But it was enough. After we hung up, I sat for a long while in the quiet of my kitchen. I knew this wasn't the end of our story, not yet. But for the first time in years, I felt the balance shifting back toward center. I had leverage now. And when the time came to use it, I would make sure the lesson landed exactly where it needed to. After that phone call, I didn't rush to act. Daniel might have been desperate for my help, but I'd learned something important over the years. When someone has taken your dignity, you don't just hand it back to them on demand. You make them feel the weight of asking for it. For the next 3 days, I went about my routine as if nothing had happened. I volunteered at the library, attended a book club meeting, even spent an afternoon tending to the small herb garden on my balcony. I knew Daniel was waiting for my answer, and that the waiting itself would test his patience. On the 4th day, I called him. Daniel, I began. I've been thinking about your request. Yeah? His voice was hopeful but cautious. I'm willing to put in a word for you, I said. But only under certain conditions. There was a pause. What kind of conditions? I want this to be public. I said plainly. If I help you get in that room, you will acknowledge me at the event in front of the board, your in-laws, and anyone else who's listening. You will introduce me by name by my profession, and you will say clearly that I am the reason you're there. He exhaled sharply. Mom, isn't that a little dramatic? No, I said, my tone firm. It's called truth, and it's long overdue. Another pause. All right, he said finally, if that's what it takes. The next step was mine. I reached out to Greg, the board member I'd spoken to at that education dinner. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, I told him I'd heard they were considering Daniel for the project. He's on the list, Greg said, but between you and me, the vote isn't leaning in his favor. Some people think he's too flashy, not grounded enough in the community's values. That's fair, I said, nodding. But he is my son, and I'm willing to vouch for him. If I stand beside him, will that change the conversation? Greg smiled faintly. Maggie, your name still carries weight here. If you say he's worth trusting, the board will listen. But I'll be honest, they'll expect you to be at the presentation if you're endorsing him. I'll be there, I said, without hesitation. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I wanted him to sit with the uncertainty a bit longer. But I did send him a short text the next morning. I'll see you at the board presentation. Wear something that fits the occasion. No emojis, no warmth. Just the kind of clipped clarity he'd often used on me. The day of the presentation arrived 2 weeks later. The community hall where the board met was a stately old building with tall windows and the faint smell of polished wood. I arrived early, wearing a navy dress and a string of pearls my mother had given me decades ago. When Daniel walked in, flanked by Claire and her parents, his eyes flicked to me, perhaps surprised to see how composed I looked. Claire gave me a polite but thin smile. Her parents nodded stiffly, as if they still weren't sure why I was there. The meeting began with introductions, and when Daniel's turn came, he stood at the podium, cleared his throat, and glanced at me. For a split second, I saw the hesitation, the old reflex to gloss over me. But then he remembered the deal. This project is important to me, he said, and I wouldn't be here without the person who first taught me the value of education and community. This is my mother, Margaret Ellison, a retired teacher who dedicated her life to shaping young minds. She's the reason I believe in this project, and her name and reputation are what made it possible for me to stand here today. His voice was steady, but I caught the slight tension in his jaw. It wasn't easy for him to say those words, not because they weren't true, but because saying them meant lowering the shield of pride he'd been hiding behind for years. I nodded slightly in acknowledgement, holding his gaze. The rest of his presentation went smoothly, but I could feel the shift in the room. The board members, many of whom I'd known for years, seemed more engaged, more willing to listen. When the meeting broke for refreshments, several of them came over to greet me warmly. Greg pulled me aside. "You've done him a real favor today, Maggie. We'll be in touch soon." Claire and her parents approached me afterward, their expressions polite but taut. Claire's mother said, "That was a lovely introduction, Margaret. Very heartfelt." I smiled faintly. It was honest. That's what counts. Daniel didn't say much as we left the hall. But when we reached the parking lot, he stopped and turned to me. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're welcome," I replied. "But remember, respect isn't something you dust off when you need it. If you want it to last, you have to show it all the time." He nodded, though. Whether the lesson had truly sunk in, I couldn't yet tell. That evening, I went home and sat on my balcony, the summer air warm against my skin. I thought about how far we'd come from that day in his in-laws' living room, basin of water in my hands, my knees pressing into the carpet. Now the image was different. I wasn't kneeling. I was standing steady and unshaken while he, in his own way, had been forced to bow. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was no longer a silent participant in my own humiliation. 3 days after the board presentation, I got the call before Daniel did. It was Greg. "Maggie," he said, his tone light with satisfaction. "The vote passed. The board is approving Daniel as one of the lead investors on one condition." I already knew what was coming, but I asked anyway. "And what's that?" "That you remain involved," he said. "They want you present for all major community planning sessions. They see you as the bridge between the project and the public. Without you, they wouldn't have signed off." I smiled, the kind of slow smile that starts in your chest before it reaches your lips. "I'll be there," I told him. When I hung up, I sat for a moment at my kitchen table, tracing the rim of my coffee cup with my finger. It wasn't just about being part of the project, it was about the message it sent. Daniel might have thought my presence was a one-time formality, but now it was a requirement. He couldn't edge me out without risking the very thing he'd fought to get. I waited until that evening to call him. "They approved you," I said as soon as he answered. I heard the relief in his voice. "Really, that's with a condition." I cut in. "I'll be attending all major planning sessions as a representative of the community." The board insisted on it. There was a pause, and then, "You planned this, didn't you?" I let the silence hang for a beat. I didn't have to. The board made their decision based on who they trust. You should be glad they see me as an asset. He exhaled slowly. "All right, if that's what it takes." The first planning session was held in a smaller meeting room at the city council offices. The walls were lined with charts, maps, and concept sketches. Daniel arrived in a tailored suit, clearly expecting to be the star of the show. But as soon as the introductions began, it was clear the board members were looking to me for context and reassurance. "This is Maggie," Gregg said to the architects and contractors. "She's the reason we know this project will serve the people it's meant to serve. Her insight into the community is invaluable." I watched Daniel's expression carefully. He smiled politely, but there was a flicker in his eyes, the faint, begrudging awareness that he was no longer the only one in control of the room. When questions came up about community needs, I spoke with authority. When debates arose over budget priorities, I weighed in with practical solutions. Years of managing limited school resources had taught me how to stretch a dollar farther than most people thought possible. By the end of the meeting, several people were taking notes on my suggestions. Daniel said little, and when he did speak, he often followed my lead, whether he realized it or not. Over the next few weeks, I became a fixture in the project. I toured potential sites with the committee, reviewed proposals, and even sat in on investor dinners. Daniel began introducing me more warmly, but I could still sense his discomfort. The shift in dynamic wasn't just happening in meetings, it was spilling into our personal interactions. One evening, after a particularly productive session, Daniel drove me home. "Mom," he said as we pulled up to my building, "I have to admit, I didn't think you'd be this involved. I turned to him. That's because you've spent years underestimating me. He winced slightly but didn't argue. You're good at this, he said finally. Better than I expected. I've always been good at this, I replied softly. You just never looked close enough to see it. Claire, on the other hand, wasn't as subtle. At a dinner her parents hosted for some of the investors, she cornered me in the kitchen. You're certainly busy these days, she said, her smile tight. I am, I said. The board keeps me involved. I can see that, she replied. Daniel's been under a lot of pressure. I hope you're not making things more complicated for him. I met her gaze. I'm making things successful for him. If that's complicated, so be it. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Just remember whose project this is. I didn't flinch. It's the community's project. I'm just making sure it stays that way. Behind the scenes, I began to hear more about Daniel's financial situation. The project's approval had boosted his standing, but his other ventures were still struggling. Investors who'd once been eager were now hesitant, waiting to see if he could deliver on this big, very public commitment. That knowledge gave me quiet confidence. He needed this to work, and by extension, he needed me. One afternoon, Greg called to tell me that the press would be covering the next planning milestone. We'd like you to speak, he said. Just a few words about the importance of the project. I agreed, knowing this was exactly the kind of moment that would cement the shift in our relationship. The day of the press event, I stood at the podium, the cameras flashing. Daniel was beside me, but the questions from reporters came to me first. I spoke about the years I'd spent in classrooms, the importance of educational access, and the community's role in shaping the future. When I finished, Daniel leaned toward the microphone. Everything you've just heard is why I'm proud to have my mother involved in this project. Her guidance has been instrumental, and I wouldn't be standing here without her. His voice was steady, and for the first time in a long time, I believed he meant it. That night, as I sat at home, I thought about the journey from that humiliating day on his in-laws' carpet to now standing on a public stage with him, acknowledging me not as an accessory, but as an equal partner. The balance had shifted, and I wasn't about to let it tip back again. Public praise is a strange thing. It can feel genuine in the moment, but the ripples it creates often reveal where the truth really lies. The morning after the press event, my phone buzzed with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Former colleagues, parents of my old students, even neighbors from decades back, all telling me they'd seen the coverage and how proud they were. I didn't hear from Claire, but I didn't need to. I knew she'd seen it. The first sign of trouble came at the next family gathering at her parents' house. The moment I walked in, the air felt colder. Claire's father gave me a curt nod, her mother offered a strained hello, and Melissa barely looked up from her phone. Daniel, ever the diplomat, tried to keep things moving as if nothing was wrong. Mom, you remember the Johnsons? He said, gesturing to a couple seated near the window. Yes, of course, I replied warmly, shaking their hands. But as the conversation flowed, I caught a subtle shift in the way some of the in-laws' friends looked at me, more attentive, more curious. It wasn't hard to guess why. The press coverage had introduced me, not as the simple mother Daniel had once painted me to be, but as someone with influence, someone integral to a high-profile project. That kind of narrative didn't sit well in a family where status was currency, and I had just raised my stock. Halfway through the afternoon, Claire cornered Daniel in the kitchen. She must have assumed I was still in the living room, but I'd stepped in to refill my glass of water. You need to be careful, she said, her voice low but sharp. People are starting to think this is her project as much as yours. I froze, staying just out of sight. Daniel sighed. It's not a bad thing if they see her as credible. The board likes it. This isn't about the board, Claire hissed. This is about perception. If you keep putting her in the spotlight, people will wonder why she's the one with all the connections instead of you. It makes you look Small. I could almost hear the tightening of Daniel's jaw. She's helping me. Without her, I wouldn't have gotten the approval. That's exactly my point, Claire shot back. You're admitting you needed her. That's not the image you've been building. There was a long pause, and I held my breath waiting. Finally, Daniel said, Claire, I did need her. And I'm not ashamed of that anymore. Her silence told me she hadn't expected that answer. I slipped back into the living room before they saw me. My heart was pounding, but not from hurt, from something closer to relief. I'd been waiting for years to hear Daniel choose me in a moment when it would cost him something. And now, in that kitchen, away from the cameras and the committees he had. Still, I knew this was only a small battle won. Claire's disapproval wasn't going to vanish overnight, and Daniel had a lifetime of habits to unlearn. Over the next few weeks, the tension simmered. At public events related to the project, Daniel treated me with genuine respect, introducing me to everyone and deferring to my expertise when questions arose. But in smaller, more private settings with his in-laws, I could sense him wrestling with himself. There were moments when he almost slipped back into old patterns, moments when a dismissive comment hovered at the edge of his tone, only for him to stop short as if catching himself in the act. One evening, after a planning meeting, we walked out together into the crisp night air. Mom, he said quietly, I know I've mishandled things before. I can't change the past, but I want to do better. I studied his face, the earnestness in his eyes. Doing better isn't about moments like this, I said. It's about what you do when I'm not in the room. When someone makes a joke at my expense or tries to push me aside, do you defend me then? Or do you stay silent? He didn't answer right away. But the fact that he didn't deflect, didn't brush it off, told me he was at least starting to hear me. The turning point came at an investor dinner hosted by one of Claire's father's business associates. The room was full of polished people with careful smiles. Halfway through the evening, a man at our table, one I didn't know, leaned back in his chair and said with a smirk, So Daniel, I hear your mom's running the show now. Guess we know who wears the pants in this family. A ripple of laughter went around the table. I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. This was the moment. The kind of moment where in the past he would have chuckled along or changed the subject. Instead, he set down his glass and looked the man squarely in the eye. She's not running the show, he said, his voice steady. She's making sure the show exists in the first place. Without her, there wouldn't be a project to talk about. I'm proud of that, and of her. The laughter died instantly. Someone coughed into their napkin. The man who'd made the comment looked away. And just like that, the conversation moved on, but the balance in the room had shifted. I could feel it. That night, as Daniel walked me to my car, I said, You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he replied. I've let too many of those moments pass. I nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about revenge. It was about finally being seen not as an accessory, not as an afterthought, but as a person worthy of respect even in the spaces where I'd once been invisible. The night Daniel defended me at that investor dinner stayed with me. Not because it was flashy, it wasn't. It was just a few sentences spoken in a calm, steady voice. But for someone like Daniel, who had built an entire persona around never needing help from simpler people, those sentences carried weight. I wasn't naive enough to think one moment could erase years of humiliation. People don't change in a single breath. They change through 1,000 small choices made when no one's looking. I needed to know if Daniel's words that night were just for show, or if they meant something deeper. 2 days later, he called me. His tone was different, softer, almost hesitant. Mom, can I come by? When he arrived, he looked tired. Not physically, Daniel had always taken care of his appearance, but in the way a person looks when they've been holding too much inside. He sat down at my kitchen table, his hands folded together like he was bracing for something. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. I leaned back, crossing my arms. For what exactly? For everything? For letting them talk to you like you didn't matter? For laughing when I should have spoken up? For acting like you were something I had to hide? His voice caught slightly and he glanced away. I think I told myself that if I could fit in with them, if I could be one of them, I'd be protecting you somehow. But I see now. I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just protecting my ego. I didn't rush to respond. I let the silence stretch, giving him the space to sit with his own words. Finally, I said, "Do you know what hurt the most, Daniel? It wasn't just that you let them treat me that way. It was that you treated me that way too. You took my love and my dignity for granted because you thought they'd always be there." He met my eyes then, and for once there was no defensiveness, just remorse. "You're right. And I hate that I made you feel that way." It would have been easy to accept the apology and move on, but words I'd learned were only the beginning. "If you mean that," I said slowly, "then I want you to prove it." He straightened in his chair. How I thought for a moment, then said, "There's a community event next weekend, a fundraiser for the library. I've been asked to help organize it. I want you to come. Not as my son, the businessman, not as a guest of honor. Just as someone willing to do the work. Set up chairs, carry boxes, talk to people, really talk to them without trying to impress them." His brow furrowed. "That's different from what I'm used to." "Exactly," I said. "If you can stand beside me in that space with no spotlight, no status to hide behind, then maybe I'll believe this change is real." The following Saturday, I arrived at the library early. Volunteers were already bustling around arranging tables and setting up the small stage for the evening's auction. I half expected Daniel to show up late, but at 8:55 his car pulled into the lot. He was dressed simply jeans, a navy polo, no flashy watch. I noticed with a flicker of amusement that he looked almost unsure of where to start. "Over here," I called, handing him a stack of folding chairs. "These need to go by the stage." For the next few hours, Daniel worked without complaint. He carried boxes of donated books, strung fairy lights along the balcony, and even climbed a rickety stepladder to hang the event banner. At one point, I caught him chatting with Mrs. Henderson, a retired teacher who had worked with me years ago. He was listening intently, not glancing around the room for someone more important to speak to. It wasn't perfect. There were still flashes of the old Daniel. When one of the local sponsors arrived in a sleek car, I saw his posture change for a moment. But then he caught my eye and smiled almost sheepishly before returning to the table he'd been helping set. By the time the fundraiser began that evening, the library was warm with the sound of laughter and conversation. Daniel stood beside me as people thanked us for our work, and when one of the organizers handed me the microphone to say a few words, I felt his hand briefly touch my elbow, a silent gesture of support. When I finished my short speech, Daniel surprised me by stepping forward. "If I could just add something," he said to the crowd. "This library has been part of my life for as long as I can remember," he began. "When I was a kid, I thought it was just a place where my mom worked. But I see now that it's more than that. It's a place where she's given pieces of herself to the community for decades. And I'm proud to be here today, not just as her son, but as her partner in making sure it thrives." The applause was genuine, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Not because of the words themselves, but because I could tell they weren't rehearsed. Later, after the event wound down and we were stacking chairs again, Daniel turned to me. "Was that enough proof?" I smiled, though my eyes were damp. "It's a good start." He grinned faintly. "I'll take it." That night, as I watched him drive away, I thought about how far we'd come from that humiliating afternoon in his in-laws' living room. We weren't finished. Trust, once cracked, takes time to repair. But for the first time, I felt we were both working toward the same thing. And deep down, I knew the moment was coming soon, the one where I would close the loop on everything. The one where the last piece of my dignity stolen in front of an audience would be restored in the same way, publicly and without question. The library fundraiser had been my test, a private proving ground where Daniel could show me he was capable of humility when no one important to his image was watching. He passed, mostly. But the truest measure would be in a space that held both worlds, mine and his. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, Greg called to invite me, and by extension Daniel, to a major community gala. The event was a blend of city officials, philanthropists, and the type of socialites Daniel's in-laws spent their lives impressing. It was also, I realized, the perfect stage. If Daniel truly meant what he'd been saying, he would acknowledge me here in front of people whose opinions he once valued more than mine, in front of his in-laws, who had made a sport out of diminishing me. When I told Daniel about the gala, he didn't hesitate. "I'll be there," he said. "We'll go together." I didn't press him for details about what he planned to say or do. If his change was real, it wouldn't need a script. The night of the gala, I arrived in a deep emerald dress I'd pulled from the back of my closet, the same one I'd worn to my retirement dinner years earlier. I'd paired it with my mother's pearl earrings, small, understated but grounding. Daniel met me at the entrance looking sharp in a tailored charcoal suit. For a moment, he simply studied me. "You look incredible, Mom." "Thank you," I said, though. I kept my tone light. Compliments were nice, but I'd learned not to mistake them for proof. The ballroom was a swirl of warm light, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations. I recognized some faces from the education board, others from Daniel's investor circles, and of course Claire's parents holding court near the center of the room. We made the rounds, Daniel introducing me to people with an ease I wasn't used to. "This is my mother, Margaret Ellison," he said over and over, and crucially, he didn't stop there. "She's the reason I'm involved in the Education Center project. She spent her life in the classroom shaping kids who are now shaping this city." Each time he looked directly at me as he spoke, not past me. I caught Claire's mother's expression when she overheard one of those introductions, a small, involuntary twitch in her jaw, as if the words didn't quite fit the version of me she'd been comfortable believing in. Midway through the evening, Greg took the stage to thank the attendees. After his opening remarks, he gestured toward Daniel. "One of our lead investors is here tonight, and he's asked to say a few words." I felt the air shift as Daniel stepped up to the microphone. Claire's parents turned toward him with expectant smiles. "Good evening," Daniel began, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "I'm honored to be part of the Education Center initiative, but tonight I want to be honest about something. I wouldn't be here without my mother." The room went still. He glanced toward me, then continued. "Some of you know her as Margaret, a retired teacher. But to me, she's the one who taught me that success means nothing if it isn't tied to community. For a long time, I forgot that lesson. I let pride get in the way, and I let people treat her in ways she didn't deserve, ways I should have stood against. That changes now." There was a murmur in the crowd, but he didn't flinch. "She is my partner in this project, and if you respect my work here, then you respect hers. So I'd like everyone to join me in acknowledging her tonight." The applause began tentatively, then swelled until the sound filled the ballroom. I stood there, every nerve in my body alight, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small in this crowd. After the applause faded, Daniel stepped down and crossed the room toward me. In front of everyone, the board, the investors, his in-laws, he took my hand and said, "Thank you, Mom." It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't for show. It was the kind of thank you that comes from a place deeper than convenience. Later, as the crowd mingled again, Claire's father approached me. "Margaret," he said stiffly, "I suppose I underestimated your role in all this." I smiled politely. "A lot of people have, but that's all right. I'm patient." He didn't have an answer for that. When the night wound down, Daniel walked me to the car. "Did I pass?" he asked, half grinning. I studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of the old performance, but what I saw was steady, unguarded. "You did," I said finally. And I didn't even have to ask. He laughed softly. Guess I'm learning. Keep at it, I told him, because this respect isn't a one-time gesture. It's a practice. As I drove home, the memory of kneeling in that living room years earlier flickered through my mind, but it didn't sting the way it used to. That image no longer defined us. Tonight's did me standing head high while my son publicly anchored his success to mine. It was more than vindication. It was closure. The gala had been a turning point, but I knew one night, no matter how public, couldn't cement a lasting change. Daniel had said all the right things, but I wanted him to live them, to feel the difference between showing respect once and carrying it forward as a habit. That chance came when Greg invited both of us to help host the first public volunteer day for the Education Center project. The city had approved the site, and now the community was coming together to clear the ground, set up temporary offices, and begin the early groundwork. It wasn't a black tie event. There would be no champagne flutes, no speeches from polished stages, just sweat dirt, and dozens of volunteers who didn't care how much money anyone had as long as they showed up ready to work. I told Daniel about it over coffee at my kitchen table. It's next Saturday, I said. We'll be working all day. Comfortable clothes, gloves, and no one is there to impress except the people giving their time. He smiled faintly. I'll be there. The morning of the event was crisp and bright, the air carrying that faint smell of freshly cut grass. When I arrived, a small crowd was already gathering: parents with kids, retired couples, young people in worn jeans and old sneakers. Greg waved from across the lot. Daniel pulled up a few minutes later wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. I noticed immediately no flashy watch, no tailored jacket slung over his arm. Just work boots and a pair of gloves tucked into his back pocket. We signed in and got our assignments. Daniel would help haul debris from one corner of the lot, while I was stationed with a group sorting and cleaning salvaged materials. At first, I watched him from a distance, curious. Old habits die hard, and part of me expected him to find a way to delegate instead of dig in. But to my surprise, he worked steadily alongside the others, hauling heavy planks, stacking crates, and even helping a teenager adjust his grip on a wheelbarrow. Every now and then, someone would call out, "Hey, Daniel, can you give us a hand?" And he'd jog over without hesitation. There was no trace of the man who once measured every action by how it looked to others. Around mid-morning, Greg asked if I could help coordinate lunch setup. I was moving folding tables into place when Daniel appeared beside me carrying 2 stacks of chairs. "Need a hand?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow. "You already are." He grinned, setting the chairs down. "Figured you could use some backup." For the next half hour, we worked side by side arranging tables, laying out paper plates, setting coolers in the shade. People passed by and greeted us, and I noticed something subtle. They weren't just talking to him because he was an investor. They were talking to him because he was there doing the work. When lunch was ready, Greg tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention. "Before we eat, I want to thank all our volunteers," he said. "And I especially want to acknowledge Daniel and his mother, Margaret. They've both been here since the start today, working just as hard as anyone else. That's what community looks like." There was a round of applause, and Daniel glanced at me. "Feels different when it's earned, doesn't it?" I said quietly. He nodded. "Yeah, it does." The afternoon brought more tasks: painting a temporary storage shed, organizing tools, even planting a small patch of flowers near the entrance. Daniel worked beside a group of elderly volunteers for nearly an hour, listening to their stories about the neighborhood. I saw him laugh, not the polished, rehearsed laugh he used at his in-laws' dinners, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. At one point, an older man patted Daniel on the back and said, "Your mom's got quite a name around here. You've got big shoes to fill." Instead of brushing it off, Daniel smiled. "I know. I'm just trying to keep up with her." By the time we wrapped up in the late afternoon, we were both tired and sweaty, our hands streaked with dirt. As we stood by the car, Daniel leaned against the door and said, "I get it now, Mom. I see why this matters to you so much. It's not about the center itself, I said. It's about the people it's for. The ones who'll never be in the glossy photos or sit at the head table but who'll feel the difference every day. He nodded slowly. I used to think influence was about who you knew in the right rooms, but I think it's also about who knows you in the rooms no one's watching. I smiled. That's a lesson worth keeping. That night, I thought about how different this day had been from the one burned into my memory the day I'd knelt in his in-laws' living room. Today, Daniel had stood beside me, not above me. He hadn't asked me to serve for the sake of his image. We had served together for something bigger than both of us. And I realized we were ready for the final step, the moment where we would stand together in front of the very people who had once witnessed my humiliation and rewrite that memory for good. The Education Center project was moving forward, and my role in it had become an accepted fact, even among those who had once questioned why I was there. But there was one circle I hadn't stepped back into fully: Claire's family. The last time I had been in their living room for a family gathering, Daniel had ordered me with a smile and a sharpness in his eyes to kneel and wash his mother-in-law's feet. I could still remember the faint scent of lavender soap in the basin, the weight of every gaze in the room pressing me lower. If this story was to have any true ending, it had to happen there. Not because I needed revenge, but because I needed to replace that memory with something else. The chance came when Claire's parents decided to host a celebratory dinner for Daniel, marking the official groundbreaking of the Education Center. It was meant to be a moment of pride for him, a social victory in their world. And I knew, if handled right, it could be the moment my dignity was restored in theirs. Daniel called to invite me personally. "I want you there, Mom," he said. "This project wouldn't exist without you, and I want everyone to know that." There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of the old discomfort. I agreed. The evening I arrived, their house looked just as it always had, immaculate, curated, every surface gleaming. But the air felt different to me. I wasn't walking in quietly this time. Daniel met me at the door. "You look perfect," he said with a genuine smile. I was wearing a simple navy dress, my hair pinned neatly, and the same pearl earrings from the gala. Inside, the dining room was full of familiar faces: Claire's parents and siblings, a few of their friends, and some people from Daniel's business circle. The clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation filled the air. Claire's father raised his glass in greeting. "Margaret, good to see you," he said, his tone neutral. I smiled. "And you?" Dinner began with the usual chatter, but when dessert plates were cleared, Claire's father tapped his glass. "Let's raise a toast to Daniel," he said, "for his leadership and vision on the new education center." Polite applause followed, but before anyone could move on, Daniel stood. "Thank you," he said. "But tonight I need to be honest. Leadership and vision aren't the whole story." He looked around the table, his gaze steady. "The truth is, I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for my mother. She didn't just open doors for me, she taught me what it means to build something that lasts. When I was too focused on appearances, she reminded me of substance. When I thought I had to do everything alone, she showed me the strength in asking for help." The room was silent, all eyes on him. "And there was a time," he continued, his voice lower now, "when I let my pride make me forget all of that. I let people treat her as less than she deserved. I even treated her that way. That's something I will always regret. But tonight, I want to make sure there's no one here who doesn't understand exactly who she is to me." He turned to me then, and in front of the very people who had once watched me kneel, he walked over, took my hand, and said, "Mom, I am proud of you, and I am proud to be your son." The applause started softly from one or two people, then spread around the table. Even Claire's parents clapped, their expressions unreadable, but their hands moving all the same. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because this moment wasn't about spilling over with emotion, it was about standing firmly in it. I squeezed Daniel's hand lightly. "Thank you," I said simply. And that was enough. After the dinner, as people mingled in the living room, several guests approached me to ask about my years as a teacher, about my role in the project. These weren't the perfunctory questions of politeness. They were curious, respectful, engaged. At one point, Claire's mother came over holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me. "Margaret," she said, "I didn't realize how much you were involved in this project. It's impressive." I smiled faintly. "A lot of things are if you look closely enough." She didn't reply, but she stayed a moment longer than I expected before moving on. When I left that night, Daniel walked me to my car. "I hope that helped replace the last time you were here," he said. "It did," I replied. "But more importantly, it told me something, that you're not just saying the right things now. You're living them." He nodded, looking almost relieved. "I'll keep doing it, Mom. Not because I have to, because I want to." Driving home, I let the night settle over me like a soft blanket. The image that used to haunt me, kneeling on that carpet, basin in hand, had been overwritten. Now the memory I would carry was of Daniel standing beside me, both of us upright, both of us seen. People talk about respect as if it's something you can demand, but I've learned it's something you build piece by piece through what you allow and what you refuse. I had allowed too much for too long, believing that keeping the peace was worth my silence. But silence is not peace, it's surrender. In the end, reclaiming my dignity wasn't about making Daniel pay for what he'd done. It was about making sure we both understood that what happened in that living room years ago could never happen again. And now, when I think about the education center, about the children and families who will walk through its doors, I know it's more than just a project. It's a reminder that even when something is taken from you, you can take it back. Sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, but always fully. If this story means anything to you, let it be this: never let anyone convince you that your worth is something they get to define. Stand when they expect you to kneel. And when you finally walk away, make sure you do it with your head high and your dignity intact.